Well, maybe one final question if we have time here, and that is another doozy, and that is Galatians 2:11 to 14, the Antioch incident, and the people who come from James and the controversy between Peter and Paul or the conflict there. Uh, what is going on in that passage as you see it, and what do you think the right interpretation is of why the people came from James and how that relates even, you mentioned it in the book, the academic view that Paul and Peter went their own ways and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we would all love to know more about that passage, isn't that? If Paul, it's so brief, but of course the readers knew all about it. So he could be exceedingly brief. So, right, Peter, Barnabas, Paul, all the Jews, they're eating with the Gentiles. I mean, that's even disputed. I think they're eating unclean food per the Old Testament, right? And now Acts 10 and 11, these foods are permitted, but at least that's how I read it. But that's even debated what they were eating. But I think they're eating together, enjoying fellowship together, signifying, right? Eating together signifies, right? Gentiles are equally part of the people of God without observing the law. Now, what did James say, or the messengers from James? I mean, it's hard to be sure, but presumably something like, I don't think James held a different gospel, but maybe he said this is causing a huge controversy. James, I always say to my students, James ministered with the Jews all his life in Jerusalem, right? Paul's with the Gentiles. Peter's kind of in the middle. So naturally, James's concern is going to be with his own context in which he ministers with Jews. And he might say, what's going on up there? This is really causing a lot of controversy because probably most Jewish Christians are keeping the laws, right? And he was worried about that, I presume. And when that message came up for Peter fearing what would happen, fearing for himself, or else fearing persecution. Again, that's debated, but he withdrew and everyone withdrew with him, including Barnabas, which was very difficult for Paul since he was Paul's missionary partner. Um, I think it's very interesting that Paul uses the verb when he reproves Peter. So, first of all, is it right for Paul to reprove Peter? Yes. Public sin has public consequences and it deserves a public rebuke, right? So sometimes people say, what was Paul doing? Why didn't he go to him in private? It was a public sin, public consequences that deserved a public rebuke. And I think that's still true today. Well, leaders who sin in a public way like that, there needs to be a public reckoning. So I think what Paul did was exactly right. Paul says to him, you are compelling you are compelling the Gentiles to live like Jews, which I interpret to be you're compelling the Gentiles to live by the law to be part of the people of God. That is the very same verb he uses of the false brothers in chapter 2, verses 3 through 5, who wanted to compel anakazo Titus as a Gentile to be circumcised. And it's the very same verb he uses in 6, 12, and 13 about the false teachers, that they're wanting to compel people to live by the law. So, so this is a very serious charge he's bringing to Peter. Now, Peter is different from the false brothers, though, because, and this is where I differ from a lot of New Testament scholars, not from evangelical circles, but Peter is not acting out of conviction, but out of fear. I mean, that's what the text says. So many people leave the text and they say, actually, Peter and Paul disagreed. But that's not what the text says. The text says Peter acted out of fear. And I think Paul is saying to Peter, Peter, inadvertently, not intentionally, are now acting the same way as the false brothers. But this whole conversation is for the sake of the Galatians, right? So they will realize that the law is not required to belong to the people of God. Therefore, Paul leaves what Peter's response was because it's irrelevant to his argument. That's not his point. They already know how Peter responded. I would argue we have good evidence in the New Testament that Peter responded First of all, in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul, which is a later letter, Paul relays the gospel in the first 11 verses, right? Christ died for our sins and was raised. And then in verse 11, he says, this is the gospel we all preach and we all believe. Well, he certainly wouldn't include Peter in that if they disagreed. Furthermore, there's so much I could say here, but the agreement in Galatians 2, 1 through 10, where Peter, James, and John ratify Paul's gospel, that agreement is absolutely meaningless if at the incident of Antioch, they end up disagreeing. I mean, and the word would get out. Such an argument it'd be ridiculous to make an argument like that, and it'd be counterproductive, and actually be deceptive, because to say, oh yeah, Peter, James, and John agreed on my gospel, but actually, when a push came to shove, and when it came down to the practical exigencies of life, we disagreed. What he says about the agreement in 2, 1 through 10 would mean nothing. So, and then we have 2 Peter, which I take to be written by Peter, where Peter commends Paul. So I think it's clear. Peter repented. I mean, Paul's talking about the gospel, 1, 8, and 9. You know, Paul says, if I or anybody else preaches a false gospel, there's a curse on them. But Paul doesn't think there's a curse on Peter. And actually, it's an encouraging passage, because we're all fallible. We can all make significant mistakes at times in our lives, and we need other brothers and sisters to reprove us.
Thank you very much. So thanks for watching. I hope this has been helpful. Remember to keep it clear and focus on Christ.